All right, good day, everyone. My name is Luke Harlow. I'm the UF-IFAS Union County Extension Director here. I'm also the Agricultural and Natural Resources Agent as well. So a lot of the clientele I work with are farmers and ranchers, but one of the other kind of groups that I get to work with is beekeepers. So today we're going to be talking to you about the basics of beekeeping, and really this is about starting to get into beekeeping itself and kind of what you need and kind of the processes that you'll want to know before you start to get involved in becoming a beekeeper. So with that, this is what we're going to be looking at today. I'll give you a slight introduction, but I do like to go in pretty much the anatomy of a bee. There are some really kind of cool things when it comes to this sort of insect, and really about the hive habits that really kind of go through with bees. We'll talk about the equipment that you'll want to get and that you'll need to get started. We'll focus on a bit of plants that you might want to get or look for on your property or around your property. And then kind of resources, where you go to get this stuff, where you get the information, who do you go to? So we'll kind of go through that. And finally, really laws and regulations. So in the state of Florida, which is what we'll be focusing on, there are certain laws or regulations that you're going to need to follow as a beginner beekeeper or as a commercial beekeeper even. Other states may have different requirements or regulations. So we're going to focus more on Florida today, but definitely start to look at what agencies or what laws are regulated in your state. And then hopefully we'll have time for a Q&A right at the end. So without further ado, we're going to get started. And really as an introduction, this is really kind of looking at what your expectations are in wanting to get into this endeavor. Is this something you just want as a hobby? Are you doing it more to improve the pollination for your crops or your plants around you? Do you really want to market the honey actually? And that's why you're going to start to get into beekeeping, is more we want to kind of create our honey and market that. Or do you just have a passion for bees and you really want to kind of get more involved and get a better understanding of how bees are managed and kind of helping out the species as a whole? One point we do really like to make is there are regional differences. How we manage bees in Florida is going to be a lot different than how we manage bees in, let's say, Washington State or, Illinois. So realizing that there are some regional differences when it comes to beekeeping, and some of those sources that you're looking at, some of the books or the websites that you're looking at, the way they recommend how you manage your bees may not necessarily be how we would do it here, or maybe they may not be how they would do it up north. So just realize there are some regional differences. Get involved with your local beekeeper clubs or associations. A majority of the state have by county different clubs or associations that you can link up with and really learn from beekeepers who have been doing this for a good couple of years. So we really highly recommend getting involved with those groups. And then research the economics behind it before you actually get in. There are a lot of different tools out there and different types of equipment that you can use or can purchase. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to purchase them. So kind of get a basic understanding of what the essentials are, and then if you want to jump into some of these other types of equipment or methods, then look at that, but really kind of gain an understanding for what the essentials are first. Be prepared for management issues throughout the season. And we'll talk about that really in the next slide or two. But there are some management issues that are with bees, and just be aware that you probably will have to deal with at least one or two of them going forward. And then also be prepared to get 6 different answers regarding the same question from about 2 or 3 different people. Beekeeping is one way or one profession where there's definitely more than one way to skin a cat. And so you might have a beekeeper give you 2 different answers, or you might have 3 beekeepers give you a couple different answers. None of them are probably wrong. It's just there is more than one way to manage the hives specifically for what you're trying to do. So just be kind of aware of that just because one person tells you to do it this way and then another person tells you to do it a different way, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, so what we're talking about is that little creature in the center picture is the honeybee. And specifically, this is the western honeybee that we're talking about, Apis mellifera. So you kind of have probably seen some posts around social media, kind of like the one on the right there, where bees are on the official endangered list in the United States. One thing I always like to talk about starting out is this is not true. Apis mellifera, the western honeybee, what we use as beekeepers, is not endangered. It is not on the endangered list. And so what this is referring to is there were 7 species of native bees specific to Hawaii that in 2017 were placed on the endangered list. And so there's been some misconception about, the fate of bees versus honeybees across the world. And so I do like to make a distinction is what we're talking about is the western honeybee, Apis mellifera, which is not endangered. Really, as of 2020 July, we had over 5,000 beekeepers within the state of Florida, managing over 200,000 hives within our state. So that is not something that really is endangered of disappearing. It's actually quite the opposite. So, I mean, on average, we gain about 2 to 5 beekeepers per week in the state. And so this is one thing that I do like to make a distinction of is the western honeybee is not endangered. It is not on the endangered list. However, we do face some factors that are causing impacts to honeybee populations. Some of that has to do with nutrition. If they're not getting the right sources, the right nectar, the right pollen, then yes, their populations are going to be impacted. And a lot of that stems from environmental impacts. We go through a season where we have a lot of drought, you can figure that the plants aren't going to be as healthy, therefore they're not going to have that nectar and pollen for the bees, and so they're going to suffer in kind. Some of that also has to deal with hive management, how we're actually helping or not helping the bees. If we're not really doing the right practices and helping those bees along as beekeepers, then yes, their bee populations are going to suffer or be impacted because of it. There are pesticide impacts. Really what I like to say on this is, again, it's kind of a misconception, is if the pesticides are being applied correctly and used wisely and correctly, we don't see much impacts from pesticide poisoning directly. And so this is also kind of one of the misconceptions. But yes, there are impacts from pesticide applications when it comes to honeybee populations as well. The big one, however, and this is really where we are seeing the impacts for bee populations, is in the pests and pathogens. We are facing current issues when it comes to certain insects called varroa mites, small hive beetles. There are a couple others that are pests of honeybee hives that are causing some impacts. And then there are pathogens as well, diseases, fungal issues that do affect the hive and the honeybees. So really, what I like to stress is, yes, we're seeing impacts. Yes, there are some difficulties and hurdles that we're facing. But on a whole, the post that you're seeing on the right is really not representative of what we're talking about when we're talking about honeybees and specifically western honeybees. So just realize that going forward, they're not on the endangered list. Our populations are doing actually pretty healthy, but we do want to make you aware of some of the impacts, and we'll be doing that later in the presentation. All right, so we're going to start with bee biology and hive habits. And so really this is a who's who in the hive, and really how is the hive organized, and figuring out maybe what bees you want to get. So realistically, again, western honeybee, Apis mellifera, that's what we're talking about. But even within just western honeybee, there are different races of Apis mellifera that you can choose what you actually get when you order your hives. Two of the main ones that we would probably recommend as a new beekeeper are going to be the Italian and the new Carniolan honeybee, because really, when you start out in beekeeping, you're probably going to be a little nervous. You know, have customarily through your life been accustomed to warding off bees and wasps, which are two totally different things, but at the same point, you may not be as comfortable around the honeybees as you have the rest of your life. And so really the first two are recommended because they're very gentle. And so as a new beekeeper, you're less likely to have some anxiety over it. They're very easy to work with. And these are two really good bee races to work with, where when we're talking about a German honeybee, they're a little more aggressive. Is not to be confused with they will sting you at every moment, but they are a little more protective of the hive, and there are some benefits to that down through the times as a beekeeper. But really starting out Western honeybee, what we're talking about is European or the new Carniolan are probably the main two that you're going to want to start with. When we're looking at the bee and pretty much the bee biology and the anatomy and physiology of a bee, there's some really cool things that I want to bring to your attention. And really, the eyesight's one of the first ones. Is they have compounded eyes, and this allows them to see front, sides, above, and below their vision, so that when they're up in the air, they can see flowers or side to side. So this is kind of a really cool feature. The other interesting thing is they can see in the ultraviolet light spectrum, whereas humans cannot. So it allows them to see all sorts of different shades of colors that we normally cannot for choosing flowers and pollen and nectar. The thing is with theirs is a little on the UV light spectrum, but on the other side, they cannot see red. So it comes up a little more like black to them than it does red. And so this, not to say you shouldn't be planting red flowers, but they're going to actively go for other colors like yellow, orange, blue, white before they will seek a red flower. So it's something kind of interesting to know when you're trying to plant your native pollinator gardens. Antennas, what they use those for is sensory, touch, communication with fellow bees and pretty much around the hive. So this is one of their main sources of how they communicate with each other and pretty much interact with each other. They do have mandibles, almost teeth when we're talking about it, that they can use for utility or potential attack or defense as well. Mostly what they're going to use it for is manipulating the hive, getting debris out of the hive, so they'll use it more for utility than they will attack, but they can use it to bite as well. Proboscis is really that kind of long, almost tongue-looking thing, and that's really kind of the closest thing you can think of analogy to it. Is this is what they're going to use to collect the nectar from a flower. So they kind of lap it up and bring it in, but that's how they're going to collect the nectar in any flower. You've probably seen some iconic photos of a bee with a pollen stuck to its back hind leg, and that's what we call a pollen basket. And those kind of long, stiff hairs that you see on the hind leg, as they're kind of moving around in the flower, those kind of collect the nectar and kind of all consolidate it into what we call the pollen basket. Another kind of key feature is going to be the stinger. So a stinger is very interesting on a bee because unlike a wasp, the honeybee stinger is barbed. On a wasp, it is smooth, so that's why a wasp can keep stinging you over and over. With a honeybee, because it's barbed, it actually latches in, and in him trying to retract it, or her, I should say, it actually tears out. So bees can only sting you once, and then they will die because in retracting it, it tears out and really kills the bee. So really this is one kind of key interesting feature to know about, that a bee can only sting you once in their life and they're going to die out. Unfortunate, but that's kind of how it is. One of the really cool features I think about bees is we never really think about how the wax is really created. How they, we kind of know about how honey is created, but how's the wax created? And it's a really cool feature that they have. They have wax glands under the underside of their abdomen that actually excrete the wax out for comb production. And so when you turn a bee over, you can actually see it So there's a photo here on the right side where you can see the wax glands excreting some wax. So it's kind of a cool feature we really don't think about normally. Their wings are also really amazing. So if you've ever, gotten stung by a couple bees or start running, you'll notice you have to run very fast. And that's because bees can actually go about 15 miles per hour. And so they can go really fast comparatively for most insects. The wings also allow them to forage and move up to 2 to 3 miles in distance. So this is a really interesting thing to know when we're talking about planting, is you may not necessarily have to plant your entire pollinator garden at your house. You could go check your neighbors, go check their neighbors, and you might have some plants around you that these bees are going to go locate. They can go up to 2 to 3 miles. So, I mean, chances are they're going to find those flowers and nectar sources and pollen sources to be able to sustain themselves. All right, so again, we're talking about Apis mellifera. Really, there are 3 caste systems in the hive itself. So when we're talking about a honeybee hive, there are 3 different castes that we look at. There's the worker, the drone, and the queen. Most of us are familiar with the queen, but we may not as be familiar with the rest of the hive, the worker and drone caste systems. So really, the worker is just that. They're the workhorse of the hive. They can have up to about 60,000 worker bees in a hive at peak production point. This could be as few as 20,000, depending on how the hive is doing. It could be even less if we have a weak hive. But really, if we've got a healthy hive, they're going to have quite a lot of worker bees that are doing various things, and their roles are in no limited fashion or order: building the comb, cleaning, defending, repairing the hive, feeding the larvae, feeding the queen, feeding the drones, gathering the nectar, pollen, water, propolis, ventilation, cooling, heating the hive. Did I miss anything? So when you think about it, workers pretty much do everything. The other key feature is the worker bee is a female bee. So let's go on to the drone. Drone is a male bee, which really, depending again on the health of the hive, you may not have very many, or up to about 500 male drones within the hive itself. Their main responsibility is really for passing the genes on by mating with not their own hive queen, but a different hive's queen. And I'll explain that process in just a bit. So really, it sounds fun to be a male. You just sit and procreate, and that's it. And females, they pretty much do all the work. But the fun thing is, it's not really fun to be a male in a colony, because several things will happen. When the male mates with the queen, he dies. So as soon as he finishes procreating, he pretty much dies. So that's not very fun. The other part is at the end of the season, during the fall and winter time, and I'll explain this in a bit, but the colony tends to minimize its population due to overwintering. And guess who's the first people they kick out of the hive, who aren't really doing very much, are the males. So really, you have 2 options. You can either mate and die, or you really at the end of the season get kind of kicked out of the house. So it's not the greatest thing to be a male when we're talking about honeybees. That brings us to queen. Normally, there is going to be 1 queen per hive. There are a couple options where you may have a new queen bee that's coming in and replacing the old queen. But realistically, you're going to have about 1 queen per hive is what you want. And all her role is really reproduction. Now, remember I said that she was going to reproduce from another drone's colony to hers, and what happens is she actually stores all the sperm from those males in her for her entire life, and then she will lay one pretty much sperm for 1 egg at a time, and just dole it out throughout her entire lifetime. It's pretty kind of interesting when we're talking about pretty much any reproduction cycle. So normally we mark the queens. You can kind of see from that dot on her back, that's not part of her anatomy. It's actually literally a piece of paint that we put on her as beekeepers. And the way we do that is so we can actually identify where she is in the hive. You've got 60,000 bees, and sometimes it can be a little hard to find one of them that you're looking for. And so a good way of doing this is to actually mark her and designate a color, so it's a little easier to try to track her down within the hives. She can lay up to 2,000 eggs in one day. And so that's why we have 60,000 bees at any given point, is she's just pumping out eggs at a rate of 2,000 if we're in good health. Her life cycle, and it depends again, regionality. In Florida, they usually live a little longer because we don't have much of a winter, so the hive's still working throughout the season, whereas in the wintertime they tend to slow down activity, and so it kind of gives them a rest. So in Florida, we're talking anywhere from about a year to 3 years. In other parts of the US or other countries, it may be up to 5 years, depending on where you are. Really, the pheromones are what control the hive, and really, if your queen is healthy and feeling good and happy, she's going to put off pheromones that really kind of give that sense of happiness, and that will be what make the hive happy. So when a queen is not doing well, when she's old, she's sick, she's grumpy, that a sense of feeling will actually rub off and go throughout the hive, and they will respond in kind. So that's why we want to make sure the hive is healthy as can be. Really, the worker bees, the drone bees, will feed on that pheromone as well. So kind of taking a look at it, we kind of mentioned that the queen's going to be laying about 2,000 eggs per day. Life cycle, when we're talking about laying an egg to once a bee becomes a fully formed honeybee, is going to dictate on what the egg that's laid out. And I'm not going to go through the whole process here, but you can kind of see from the chart, if it's going to be a worker egg, it takes them about 21 days from laying an egg to emerging from the cell as a fully formed honeybee. If we're talking about a new queen bee that comes out, it's going to only take about 16 days. If it's going to be a drone bee, it'll take about 24 days. So we're only talking about a couple weeks from laying an egg to emerging as a fully formed bee. So when you've got 2,000 eggs pumping out every 3 weeks, I mean, you've got a lot of production that's going on, which is why the queen only lasts for so many years. Bee populations, and I kind of mentioned this a little earlier, are going to be dictated by several things: health of the hive, but another thing is seasonality when we're talking about pollen production. So we all know that certain plants will flower and produce for short bouts of times, usually a couple of weeks. The hive knows this, and there are peak production times for when we're talking about flower, nectar, pollen production, and how the hive responds to that. They know if they're going to be in a low pollen source time, the queen may not start producing as much because they almost need to conserve some of that pollen and nectar that they've got available to them. So there are times where we have blooms and dearths, and dearth is pretty much one of those low peak areas where we don't have a lot going on. So this does sometimes stress out the hive. If they don't have enough pollen and nectar sources around them, it can stress the hive out. You may also have other stressors that happen, whether it's a weak queen or an old queen. She's not producing as much. And so there are several ways to work with this as beekeepers, and several ways that the bees themselves will handle this. Is they will start an initiation or initiate a process called succession, which is literally old queen is not doing what she should be, and they're going to pretty much oust her, create a new queen, and a new queen's going to take over. And so what this does is a new queen cell is initiated. which once that emerges will be a new queen that will take over the hive. Another option is, again, us as beekeepers can replace that queen if we start to realize that she is either unhealthy or not doing as well, she's old. We want those hives to be as healthy as possible, and if we start seeing things go south, it is kind of our role to kind of make sure that the whole hive is healthy as can be. And so one option to do this is to replace the queen herself through us, and you order through the mail a new queen, and once you get her, you replace that queen. So there are a couple different things when we're talking about the health of a hive versus seasonality. You've got to realize that bee populations will ebb and flow, but you've also got to realize that at some points there are times where your hive is not going to be as healthy, and you need to react in kind. Then there's bee swarming. You probably have seen bee swarms before. You may have seen them in person. You may have seen them online. The top photo was an iconic photo where there was a bee swarm and the queen bee actually got stuck in the car. So the whole hive kind of followed her and went and got stuck to the car, and it was pretty humorous from my understanding. Really, swarming is a natural response to what we call buildup in the spring, and that's when the hives are actually doing really well. They're actually building up populations, and they're almost getting too much. And what happens is the queen actually decides, okay, there are too many of us in one spot. It can't contain, the house can't contain all of us. So what's going to happen is I'm going to take about 50% of us, go find a new home, and leave a new queen here to manage the rest of the who's left in the house. And that's really what it is you have a queen bee who is taking a good portion of the hive with her to go find a new home. And that's what you're seeing here in the photos is the queen is taking a good chunk of the population to search and scout for a new location to set up shop. And in these photos, what you're probably seeing is almost a resting and reconnaissance. They're not setting up shop right then and there, but they are taking a short break, looking for an area that would be a good location. Because realistically, where are the hives? They're going to be enclosed spaces. They're going to be, where it's easy to get from and get to. So they're not going to be out on a tree branch for the most part. They're not going to be sitting on a crane. They're going to want to be in a tight area, maybe an electrical panel, a junction box. Maybe it's going to be in the house on a wall, or maybe it's going to be inside a dead tree hollow or something like that. So these photos that you're seeing are probably more rest and recon where they're looking for a place. They'll probably sit there for an hour or two and then move away from that location. All right, so for our next section, we're going to be talking about beekeeping equipment. And this is really what is what and what do you need? Because there is a lot of different items out there that you can purchase, but we're going to walk you through kind of the essential items of what you need to start in beekeeping, and kind of we'll go from there. So Langstroth hide is really the iconic beekeeping boxes that you will see. There are some different shapes or different styles of bee boxes that you can get involved in, whether it's a top bar hive. Really today we're going to be focusing more on the Langstroth hide because it's really kind of the basic one that's out there for the most part. So you have several different things that are here, and I've kind of broken them out by section, and we're going to walk you through top to bottom. So realistically, cover. We want a cover. It's kind of simplistic. Think of it as a house. You want a roof on a house to help you get protected from different elements, whether it's rain, wind, heat. The cover is there really to protect the bees from all that. There are a couple different options. There's a telescoping and inner cover option where it's two pieces put together. Usually that top telescoping part is a metal covering, and then the inner cover is more of a wood frame covering to sit down over the boxes. There are migratory lids, which is pretty much almost a solid wood. Pretty much all their main functions are protection elements, and that's what their main purpose is. So Really, this is the kind of key features of the hives is the hive boxes. Most of these are all generic and uniform dimensions, length times width, so they're all stackable. So when you order it from one manufacturer to one, they should all be the same. There are some different variations when we're talking about height, which you can kind of see from there. The top one's more of a shallow, middle one's more of a medium, just a little taller, and then the bottom one is what's called a deep, which again, it's just a little taller. The reason for this, and I'll explain in the next slide, it is really has to do about weight, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. This is going to be really integral or necessary when you start getting into beekeeping. A queen excluder is really there to prevent the queen bee, who we customarily have in the bottom boxes, and it really prevents her from getting into the top boxes. And why would we want to do this? Well, if we didn't have that, the queen would be able to go up and down at will, laying eggs, and you also have egg production, but then the worker bees are going to be managing those egg cells, but also managing honey cells. So all your honey and brood is what we would call that egg cell production. All your honey and brood is going to be mixed up. As beekeepers, that's a lot harder for us to manage, so the queen excluder is there to prevent the queen from going up, so that a lot of the brood is going to be down at the bottom boxes, and you can utilize the top boxes more just as honey production. So it makes it a lot easier for us as bees when we're trying to manage our hive for honey. It makes it a lot easier. So, and then this all sits on what is called a bottom board. You will see some solid wood bottom boards, and then you will see screen bottom boards. Again, this is a regional difference. Some places will recommend a wooden bottom board. A lot of that has to do with the winter cold times and the fact that it will keep the hive warmer. In Florida, we really don't get that cold, and so we really recommend a screen bottom board for several reasons. One of them is going to be, again, because we don't get really that cold, but it helps a lot with some pest issues as well. But really that bottom board would have a screen so that the bees don't, just drop out, but you still have some ventilation and airflow. So again, you have the boxes here. Each box will hold what's called frames. And those are those two pictures of the person holding those middle frames up. The left one, which is kind of like a solid yellow, is really an untouched frame with foundation, and that's pretty much just a plastic base that the bees can build their combs off of. The right one is one that's kind of had honeycomb built on it, and so that's probably going to either be egg production, or if it's a different one, it could be honey production, but that's ultimately what it's going to look like when you start getting the bees. And those are just thin frames that slide in, and they could fit, depending on which one you go with, 8 of those frames could fit in a box, or 10 of those frames could fit in a box, depending on which setup you go with. I had kind of mentioned about shallow, medium, and deep boxes and why you might want one or the other. This has a lot to do with weight capacity. So when we're talking about honey actually weighs a lot. And so if you have a fully stocked honey box, even a shallow honey fully stocked is going to probably be anywhere from about, I think, 40 some pounds of weight that you're going to have to lift and move. Whereas the deep could be about 70 pounds. So if it were me, I would not want to be lifting 70 pounds of honey every time I open up the hive. So this is where usually the brood is recommended, the deep boxes. And as once you start getting up in the upper boxes, you might want to go to a medium or shallow, which is a little lighter in weight. So the equipment, what you're going to need. First off, you want to make sure you're protected. So we need to have PPEs, or personal protective equipment, to make sure that you aren't going to get stung. Even the most veteran beekeepers will bring this with them. They may not wear it to start out, but if a hive gets grumpy, they have it on hand to put it on so they don't get really stung up by bees. There are a lot of different options. You could have a full bodysuit. You could have just almost a jacket veil. You could have just a veil and then gloves. So depending on how much you want to spend and what you're comfortable with, really you don't need to go for a full bodysuit, but if you want to and you're makes you more comfortable, that is an option. But really the essentials would be gloves, which kind of go over to your arms, and then a veil or a jacket is really what I would recommend, especially starting out. Once you start getting comfortable and you realize that your bees are going to be perfectly fine with you, you don't necessarily need them, but that's also a point of interpretation on what you feel is comfortable. Hive tool is really essential, and this is what we use to kind of manipulate and move the frames around and take the boxes off of each other. You can scrape off different debris from the hives. So this one's kind of essential to have as well. And really a smoker is the other third essential thing that you really need. And why this is essential, I mean, you all probably have kind of seen a smoker when you're looking at beekeeping photos. Its purpose is really to mask the alarm pheromone for bees. It's not really to make the bees disoriented or kind of make them choke out or anything of that nature. It really masks that alarm pheromone. So think about it when we're taking the hive apart, moving box from box. If I'm a bee, I'm going to get really alarmed because someone's taking the roof off of my house. And so the bees kind of obviously get alarmed, and that smoke is there to mask that pheromone so they don't all freak out. And so really the fuel that's used to create the smoke can be a lot of different things. You can purchase pellets, wood chips, cloth, pine straw. If you've got pine trees, use the pine straw. It's cheap, easy, and works pretty well. So there are a couple of different fuel sources that you can use. Costs. I usually like to at least bring some of the different costs. We talked about all the equipment, the hive, everything. So how much is this going to run? So really, if we're talking about bare minimum basics, when you're talking about hive body, hive super, bottom board, telescoping cover, queen excluder, smoker fuel, hive tools, your PPEs, when you get down to it, and this is a very generalized rule, you could find it cheaper. You could also find it more expensive depending on which manufacturer or distributor you go through. It's going to run you at least about $300 on average. And so this is pretty much a startup initial cost for your equipment for when we're talking about beekeeping. So I do like to bring that point home, is that, this isn't going to be a $10 paint easel. Of course, that's expensive too, but it's not going to be a cheap investment when you get into it. However, when we're talking about hobbies, this is one of the cheaper startups for hobbies that I've ever been able to be involved in. So what thing are we missing here? So we've got all the equipment, all the PPEs, the hives, but we're missing one very big integral thing when we're talking about beekeeping. We are missing the bees. So when you start out, you will have to purchase bees unless you have a link up with a beekeeper who is providing them for you. You will probably have to purchase them, and depending on which option you go with, could be anywhere from about $100 to $250 for either a nuc or a package of bees. So what those two things are there two different ways that you can get bees. And to be honest, I will probably recommend a nuc over a package of bees, especially starting out. The reason for it is a nuc is pretty much almost a bee box. It's 5 frames, and it's in pretty much a beehive box that you would get. But the frames already have your bees, your queen usually, and then the hive it is already started out. So usually you already have some brood on those frames. And I usually like to think about this as almost from a plant standards, you're almost getting transplants to start out your beekeeping hive. You've already got some brood in there, so you've already got some bees that are going to be coming up, and it doesn't take as much energy for them to create your colony and establish themselves. Package of bees, however, is really that. It's literally a box of bees, and so they have no reserves, no honey reserves, no brood in there. And so they have to start from scratch. And what you're going to do is literally just take that box, dump it upside down in your hive, and let them go. But this is where I usually make an analogy of seeds when we're talking about plants. So you're talking about pretty much starting a transplant, which already has kind of semi-established, versus starting something from seed. And so it's a lot easier, especially as a newer beekeeper, to start something from transplant than it is from seed. And so we really recommend the nuc over a package of bees, but either one works. It's just, again, depending on how you want to go about it. Okay, so honeybee nutrition. Like I said in one of the introduction slides, nutrition is one of those that really sometimes the bees need help with. And so what we'll talk about is really kind of what the food sources are out there, and then maybe what the supplemental food sources that we have to provide to honeybees are. So really, to start out, what do the bees need? And I think every new beekeeper needs to realize that is really what the bees need to sustain themselves and then provide honey for us if we're going that direction. So really, there's pollen. We kind of all realize, yes, they need pollen, but what's its really need, what's its addressing, is protein. And that's a major thing for the bees. Just like humans, we need protein, we need fat, lipids, vitamins, minerals, and this is what that pollen provides. So the pollen source, the protein source, is really going to vary based on flower to flower and species to species. Some pollen content is really good for them. Some pollen content is really not that good. So you got that nice car that definitely needs a bath, and we've all, I think, seen that, especially if we have pine timber anywhere around us. We've kind of seen this when pine trees are in bloom. So you might think, oh, this is great for the honeybees. They've got a great source of pine pollen. The problem is, if you looked at the good pollen ranges for the amount of protein, pine is 7%, and that's a horrible amount of protein that's with pine trees. What's a really good range is anything from about 20 to 30% is just a really good crude protein pollen source. And so that's plants like almonds, any of the cucurbits, pumpkins, watermelons, all that sort of stuff, have a really good crude protein source for honeybees. I've given a few here. If you're interested, there is a good source down at the link that I've done below, which is Fat Bees, Skinny Bees. We don't have a very good resource to say what flowers and what plants have the amount of good quality protein. That document is probably one of the best ones that I've seen around. So in towards the back in the appendices, they do have a listing of different plants. It's more of a national, so it's not specific to Florida, but you can find some varying plants and flowers and figure out kind of what the crude protein is for honeybees. So that's one big thing for what the bees are going to really need. Number two is the nectar. So this is really where they get their sugars, and really they composed of sucralose, and they convert it into fructose and glucose. So the workers will carry the nectar in their stomach, and I will say their honey stomach because this is not really the stomach they eat out of. They do have a separate pouch, and then what happens is they'll kind of regurgitate it into the hive to be put into the honeycomb. So some people are already thinking, well, I'm eating honey vomit, or bee vomit is what I'm eating when I eat honey, and it's not exactly that, but it's kind of. So and what will happen is the bees will maintain the moisture content by fanning their wings and reduce the moisture content of that nectar to be able to bring it down to what we would call honey, and then they cap it as their winter reserves. So really the nectar is there as their carbohydrates, protein or pollen is really there as their protein source. So just like we need carbohydrates and protein, so do bees need it, and that's where they get the honey and nectar, or the nectar and pollen from. Another thing that they're going to need is water. Just like every being out there, we need it for pretty much digestion, metabolism, and they're going to use it also to regulate the temperature in the hive. So this is why they need a good water source somewhere around them. It doesn't, again, have to be right next to the hive. Closer the better, but again, they're going to be foraging up to 2 to 3 miles away, so they will find it if they need it. But if you're relying on a pond that's about 2 miles away, you got to figure that they're going to be spending a lot of energy going those 2 miles to get the water to bring it back, or even the pollen and nectar. So the closer the better for water and the flowers, that is going to be better. But really, these are the 3 things that they're going to need: pollen, nectar, water. So what they're going to be trying to seek out, especially with the pollen and nectar, are the flowers, and really they're going to be looking for certain traits. Remember I said red is really not in their light spectrum, but they will be looking for the blues, the yellows, the oranges, and they're going to be looking for flowers that, when we kind of think about it, have a good landing pad for them. They don't want something that's extremely small, open space. Think about a blueberry flower is kind of more bell-shaped. They will get into it, but they'd rather have kind of an open-faced flower like what you see there than something bell that they're going to have to try to move into. And so they like bowl-shaped, asymmetrical. Again, think of ease of access. If I'm going to be trying to land on something, I want something flat and easy to land on. It's also a sense of smell, again, by the antennas, by the pheromones of the pollen quality. So they will try to actively search out better quality pollen than they will low quality pollen. So really the objectives they're going to be looking for are, is the pollen easy to release? Can I actively get it? Does it smell good? Is it a good quality pollen? And does it hold enough nectar that it's worth my time flying to that flower and gaining? So this is really, from the bees' perspective, what they're trying to get. So trying to figure out a way of helping them out. What I, again, recommend, look at your neighbors, look at your neighbors' neighbors, look at their neighbors. If you don't have the plant material that your bees need, chances are your neighbors may. Unless your neighbor is 3 miles away, then we may want to start planting something at your place. Chances are, if you're in an urban or subdivision, you're going to have a very good variety of plants that the bees can go get. You do want to monitor the blooms and dearth periods. There are some documents that will walk you through, okay, what plants are blooming in March? What do I need to be looking for in April? So there are some documents that I'll give you in just a few minutes. We do recommend pollinator friendly. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be native, although, I mean, that's a good rule of thumb to have a native pollinator plant. The one thing we do not recommend is planting invasives. That's one of those that we don't recommend. There are also certain plants like the 2 that are shown here. Yellow jessamine is one that technically is toxic to honeybees. So these 2 plants we don't recommend planting at all. If you've got some on your property, it's usually a case-by-case basis of whether you want to remove it or just leave it. It may not really harm the plants if it's one plant, but again, these 2 are not very good for bee populations. So what are kind of some resources that you got? UF maintains a beekeeper management calendar, and on the bottom you've got pretty much a what's blooming category, so you can kind of see what plants are actually in bloom throughout the months, depending on if you're North, Central, or South Florida. So this is kind of a good idea of figuring out what to look for in your area to figure out if your bees actually have something to forage for. There are some other universities that have created building native pollinator gardens. Michigan State has a really good one. You also have Xerces Society, which walks you through how to install, how you want to actually lay it out. So these are some good resources for trying to plant your native or pollinator gardens. So what happens when we just don't have the blooming plants around us when we're in a dearth period? We're going to need to help the bees out. And so one way we do this is to provide 2 things: sugar water and pollen. And sugar water is really a substitute for the nectar. and there are pollen patties or other just containers of pollen that obviously substitute the pollen. So really, these are kind of the two things that during certain times of the year you may not have to provide because the bees have it at readily available from around them. At other times of the year, we're going to need to provide these two things to the bees so that they can thrive and manage them, help them manage themselves. Depending on the sugar water, there are a couple different ratios that you may see. There's a 1-to-1, a 2-to-1. I've seen a 3-to-2. So again, depending on your regionality and what you're trying to do, you may need a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar to water ratio. And then you pretty much have a mason jar or something similar that has holes poked in the lid, and then it's turned upside down where the holes are small enough where you're not going to drip out that sugar water, and it's vacuum sealed so that you don't literally drip the water into the hive, but when the bees go to that lid, they actually take their proboscis and lick up that honey out of those holes. So really, this is a substitute that we give, and here in Florida, we really recommend you substitute this. Again, depending on the season, you may not have to. If you're really got a nice bloom going on and you put this out there, you may see it just sit there and the bees won't even touch it because they'd rather go get the pollen and nectar themselves. At other times, you will see this drain down very quick and you're going to have to replenish it for them. But really, you have to monitor that consumption, again, given that dearth and bloom period. Okay, so beekeeping resources. Where do I go? Where do I get all this stuff? How do I start? These are some of the questions we'll go through in this section. So realistically, I highly recommend university resources. Yes, I work for a University of Florida, but that doesn't mean you have to just use University of Florida's resources. There are a lot of other universities that are doing a lot of research in apiculture and beekeeping. So use these resources because they're doing all the research and have a lot of the good information that is out there. I will say I've given you a link for UF for our honeybee lab. Dr. Jamie Ellis is really our guru of bees. So he's got a lot of resources on that website for both beginner beekeepers and also intermediate and advanced beekeepers. So there is a lot of information that you can go through on that website. Honeybee Health Coalition is another one that we recommend. They have a lot of good information when it comes to honeybee health. How to manage your hive to make it as healthy as possible. What are the different diseases? What are the different pests that you're going to have to fight, and how you manage them. So Honeybee Health Coalition is honestly one of our other main go-tos for any information when it comes to beekeeping. State of Florida does have a state beekeepers association. So they do have this as a resource. You can join their membership, and then they also have districts in each of the areas of Florida where you can kind of get a little closer to home. So a lot of times you will find local chapters in your area. If you go through the State Beekeepers Association website, you can kind of filter and find out if you're in the Panhandle or South Florida or Northeast Florida. There will be a chapter around you that you can get help from local beekeepers that are involved with a state association. Bee Informed is another great website that you can go that has a lot of information on beekeeping management and beekeeping health. If you're like me and like books and ones that aren't on an iPad, I like physical books. These are some books that we've compiled throughout the years. Yes, even Beekeeping for Dummies is actually not a bad resource when it comes to beekeeping. So you can look at all these. I will say again, understand the regionality. So look at the author, look at where they are from. If you're in Florida and the author is from Michigan, you might see some differences about what they're going to be recommending for beekeeper management versus what might be down here in Florida. So it comes with that caveat of realize again there's a regionality, but these are some really good books that are out there for beekeeping principles and management. Other resources, and I've said it several times, look for your local beekeeping chapters, your clubs, your organizations. These are going to be really good resources to help you out if you're having a problem, if you just need almost a mentor to help you and guide you through starting out. These are going to be local people that are going to really be there to help you do that. Here in Union County, we've got a beekeepers club, that really helps out with our new beekeepers who are interested. They'll kind of mentor. So from that side, I would highly recommend you get involved with your local chapters. Equipment. Where do I go to get all this stuff? So these are some manufacturers and distributors of the beekeeping equipment. Better Bee, Dadan, Rossmann. These are all distributors of the hive boxes, the PPEs, the tools, smokers. So you can look at each one of these. There are more out there. You might find a local beekeeper distributor that you can work through that may get you better pricing or better equipment. But these are some of the kind of national or state ones that are out there. All right, so last section that we really have to address is the regulations and laws when we're talking about starting out into beekeeping. And really this is kind of what laws pertain to me. So under the state of Florida, if you start out in beekeeping, beekeeping is regulated by the Department of Agriculture for our Bureau of Plant Apiary Inspection. And there's some reasons why, and there's some really good reasons why. And so what their job is there to really protect honeybee populations. That is their main goal, and their main desire is to make sure that bees have a nice, healthy population, and we're doing everything that we can to keep that in that status. And so anyone who manages bees is really going to be involved in that. And so Department of Ag really regulates the industry. They also regulate unwanted races of bees. And so what that is referring to is Africanized honeybees. I'm not really going to get too in depth on that right now in this presentation, but realize that there are Africanized honeybees in Florida. Really the main population is about Orlando, the I-4 corridor south. We don't really have much of an issue if we're talking about Panhandle or Northeast Florida. Most of the populations for Africanized honeybees are in the south, or again, kind of that I-4 corridor going southwards. But that is one of the Department of Ag's responsibilities, is to regulate and make sure that Africanized honeybees are minimized as much as we can. Shipping and transportation of bees, and then production of honeybees and honeybee colonies. So this does pertain to hobbyists and also someone starting out as a beekeeper. There are laws and regulations that if you want to start out in bees, you have to be registered with the Department of Agriculture. So really starting out in that process, there is an easy application. You just fill it out. There is a small processing fee of $10. And again, if you're starting out, you're probably not going to be above this 1 to 5 colony mark. You're probably going to want 1 or 2. So it's an annual fee of $10 for your entire hive setup. It's not just $10 per hive. It's 1 to 5 colonies. You've got $10. If you start getting more and you get a fever and the prescription is more hives, then yes, you're going to have to pay a little more. But beyond that, if you're starting out, $10 is really the annual fee. You're going to be lumped in as a backyard beekeeper from 1 to 40 hives. So realistically, a vast majority of our beekeepers are backyarders, between 1 and 40 colonies that they're managing. We have some good commercial outfits, but majority of them are going to be backyarders or hobbyists. Along with this, the bee inspector will come by usually about once a year, just to inspect your hive, see how they're doing, see how you're doing. This is not a, hey, hammer's coming down, you're doing things wrong. I don't know one inspector that I've met where that's the case. They really should be educators rather than be inspectors, because they are there really to help you educate and then make sure your bees are as healthy as can be. So if they see something where your bees aren't as healthy, or you have a question, they will give you the answers, and they will help you manage your bees better and healthier. So really, I would not be afraid of this process. They are probably one of the friendliest inspectors that I know of when we're talking about. So really, get signed up, your hives, and then when you do this, you'll be kind of classified into one of two. If you're on agricultural lands, if you're more rural and your property is zoned agricultural, there aren't really too much benchmarks that you'll have to meet. But if you're more in an urban area, there will be a beekeeper compliance agreement that you will have to sign as well. And really, this is just saying you're going to follow the guidelines for the management of the bees, to protect your neighbors, to protect you. And really, there are some benchmarks that you have to meet, where you can't have it butt up against your property line. It's got to be about 15 feet away. And then you've got to have a barrier set up around the hive. Doesn't necessarily mean or dictate what sort of barrier. It could be a hedge line that you've got around, and area around your hive with a gate, or it could be just a fenced-in area. And really, this is to protect other people who might be in your backyard from accessing the hive without your knowledge, or so the bees can fly up and around your hive rather than through, let's say, your neighbor's area, and potentially cause harm or sting your neighbor. Really, it's got to be off public property. So a lot of what this is saying, it can't be in a easement. It really has to be more in your backyard, and it's got to be in controlled access. So again, backyard area where you've got control over the area. And really, again, this is why we're managing and why we're regulating some of these things, is really all these issues right here. And we've talked about some of the pathogens, some of the pests. Pests is probably one of the biggest ones, and that one in the center that looks like a little tiny spider mite thing, that's the varroa mite. And this is one of the main issues that we're seeing with bee populations, whether it's a hobbyist, a backyarder, or a commercial beekeeper. This is one of the biggest issues that we're facing within managing bees today. Is they're causing major issues. They latch onto the bees and feed off of them, and so right there is probably one of the biggest issues. You do have viruses, bacteria that can potentially cause issues, and then management from beekeepers who we may not necessarily be doing it correctly, or we're not sure. So this is why the state is regulating this, is to help us manage the bees better, and then also, managing or minimizing environmental impacts. So there are some programs out there for, like, if your bees get destroyed by a hurricane, if you think your bees were killed off by a pesticide incident, Department of Ag is there to help you along with that process. So really, the goal of a Department of Ag is really there to help minimize impacts to the honeybee itself. So really, in review, kind of taking a look at it, one of the biggest recommendations as I can make is, before you jump head in, do your research before jumping in, and just make sure you're aware of kind of the management side to it, what you may need. In Florida, when you're ready, I do recommend ordering your bees in the fall to be delivered to you in the spring. And there are a couple of reasons why. Is we don't want you to get the bees in the fall because they don't have enough time to set up resources for themselves to overwinter and supply themselves and sustain themselves throughout the winter. So we really recommend you get them in the spring, so that they have that nice spring bloom and pretty much a good amount of time to get their hive set up to handle that next winter. The problem is, if you try to order them in the spring, is usually everyone else has done the same thing and there are no bees left to order. So we really recommend trying to pre-order them in the fall time, get your hive set up, get ready to get the bees, and then get them delivered in the springtime. Really, 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 and I do mean really, get involved with your local beekeepers. They're there to help you out. I've never met one beekeeper who isn't eager to help mentor or at least guide a new beekeeper. We're all pretty passionate about it, so they are going to be there to help you out. That means shadowing kind of a beekeeper beforehand and you get a little more comfortable. I'd suggest doing that one. Also, contact your local bee inspector and just let him know once you get your bees. Chances are he'll say, great, get your hive set up. In a couple months, I'll come out and help you guide through this starting process. However, be prepared for some management issues. We just talked about a bunch of them. You will face some of these management issues, whether it's environmental, whether it's nutritional, whether it's pest. You will probably face some of these issues. But lastly, have fun and just enjoy your beekeeping. It is one of the most enjoyable parts of agriculture that I've been involved in. And so you can really have some fun, and that's really it for our presentation today. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer any. But thank you for joining. And again, if you need any other follow-up questions, my contact info is right here below. And again, thank you. My name is Luke Harlow, and have a great day.